Okay, so good morning, everyone. I think we have people from different areas. Uh, Only one request I have everyone saying that the link what you have received, it's a single name. Request everyone to rename it so that when we do Wheel of Fortune at the end of it, that time we will be able to recognize who is the actual uh, person who has joined in. So just take a minute, by the time I'm introducing it, so if you can rename yourself, I think it will be good. Yeah. I think we have, this is Saturday. I know that, all, whether IS or IT people, we have a tough time, whether it is geopolitical issue or whether it is um, the budget or whether it is year end or, any kind of event, or let's say vulnerability like Log4j or ransomware. So it becomes too difficult, and I understand for IS and IT it is very taxing, and this is Saturday, but I think uh, and I still remember the book of Carnegie Ritchie, which was on sea in my times. Vishnit might not be able to even correlate it, and young generation may not be able to correlate it, but on the first page itself it was written that what is constant is change is the constant, and we all have seen that across our tenure of experience what we have it, right? So in the change management it is very indifferent that we, and it's inevitable that we have to learn something, and Saturday and Sunday, these are the only two things what I think that it's a good time for us, where we do not have operational activity or meeting or responses or escalation, and that's a very peace of mind what we have to learn or on what is going on new, and how do we learn from ourselves. We always talk about, if black hat guys, if they collaborate, okay, why defenders cannot collaborate, and that's the theme what we are trying to drive it maybe across 3 to 4 months. And just to introduce, I think a lot of people, there are repeat uh, continuous attendees also which we see it, but I mean, just to reintroduce for the new people about the Elite CISO. So Elite CISO is 3.5-year baby, and this has grown in seven cities in India and Dubai. These are all the active chapters. We have all, and we don't do only the knowledge sharing. We want to build this as the community. We want to build this as a family. And we have just extended to Dubai recently, but we would like to really make this as a global platform where we learn from each other, from the global practices, as well as have a mind share from our side. And India is no more like copying it. India is also setting the benchmark for other countries where they can learn from India also. And I think tax security is one of the example that local being global, or make in India, whatever we call it. And last 5 years, we are seeing those kind of branding, which our country is doing it. And we are proud of that. So today's session is demystifying enterprise security and connecting the dots. There is a lot to have a takeaway from this event. And I am personally looking forward to have this takeaway. The person from whom we are going to take away is Chris Fisher. Just to introduce about Chris has been, and I was having a just casual chat with Chris, that Chris has such a diversified experience, and I'm impressed, Chris, the way you are coming with different experience. Like he has started his job from PwC as the auditor, then he moved to security, then he moved to IT, and then he's the marketing officer now. And having this diversified, and having, one is that the change is saying that you are always hungry for learning a different topic, and how do you enrich actual practices with your knowledge, and I'm sure this is what you're bringing it to our team, for all of us. Krishnit has also, it's not only on the consulting side, Krish has also worked with Tripwire, and last 2 years he's associated with the tax security. So Chris is going to take the session. And to introduce the other panelists, Krishnit, I think Krishnit doesn't need any introduction according to me. but just giving some input to the people. And I'm proud that I'm hosting Krishnit. Krishnit is a part of Forbes list. Krishnit, whatever introduction document I have, I think I'll introduce you what I know about you, right? And whatever little I have read about you. So Krishnit is a part of 40 under 40 Forbes list, and he's another example. And honestly, Krishnit, I give that example to my kid also, that how a young chap who has probably passionate about something. And I have read here one of the article that in 8th or 9th standard, you had academically marks as the problem, but you have also written that because you were too much involved into a security and so those hands-on kind of thing. And the very early stage of the of you have written your book. I'm sorry, I'm reading out a lot of things which I know, and it's not formally in your document, but I would like to really bring what I know to the table so that people really understand the different side of it. And so Krishnit has also started tax security long back. He has worked with me. He has worked with a lot of big companies, maybe NPCI or lot many other clients. What he has, he was also 30 under 30, 40 under 40, 35 under 35. I think the list goes on and on. And Krishnit, great to have you as a session. And I would like to host your session for the youngsters sometime later on how do you work with the passion and how do you achieve your passion, and you are the example over it for the same. So it's interesting topic. I'll not take much time. Just to read on a LHC side, one is this knowledge session, what we are having it today. This is the way how we do it every Thursday and Saturdays, not continuously Saturdays, but every Thursday, 11 to 12, we already have this. As a community, we understand that there's a lot of stress. So we do conduct a lot of health sessions. We do a lot of social activities. If you are interested into that, please go to the website, join and give us the message, and we will add you to respective group. So not taking time much, Chris, over to you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that warm welcome and that nice introduction, Anupita and Val. I appreciate you inviting us to share today with this audience. We're honored to be part of this and do some knowledge sharing with all of you.
Chris, just one minute. I'll make one more announcement to everyone. Request everybody, because you're shown as Bhairavi, and whatever the wheel of fortune, what we do it at the end of the session, the surprise gift will go to Bhairavi only. So,
I think she planned that.
Change your name.
I think she planned it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Let me go ahead and jump into the topic then. Now that we've been introduced, our topic today is demystifying enterprise security, and we're going to focus on connecting the dots. And as you all know, being a security practitioner, there are a lot of dots to try and connect. And that's one of the challenges that you all face as you're working to protect your organizations and trying to manage the processes and the tools and the people. It's hard to connect the dots. We know that, we understand that. And what we're going to do is use our product platform as the example, which is just one of the dots. It's the vulnerability management piece. And if we could just go to the first slide, we'll start to talk about how that works in most organizations. So Akash, please, if you could go to the next slide. I'm not able to page down. Great. So on this slide, what we're looking at is the Center for Internet Security 20 critical security controls, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. This is a framework. It is one of many security frameworks out there, which has a list of what you would call the security controls that you need to put in play in your organization to make sure that you have adequate coverage of the attack surfaces. My point in sharing this slide is really just to point out that vulnerability management has always been one of the dots, one of many dots. It is not the control, it is one of many controls. And on this slide, what you're seeing is the way that the Center for Internet Security changed their approach to the controls from version 7 to version 8. And as you can see, vulnerability management was in version 7, it was in their earlier versions, and oh, by the way, it still appears in version 8 as the 7th control on this list. They've done some changing, they've done some rearranging over the years, but vulnerability management has always been one of the dots. And it is one of the dots in other frameworks that you may be familiar with and may be using in your organization. For example, a PCI standard, or in the US, we have the NIST framework or the HIPAA framework. So vulnerability as a key security control is there, it's consistent, it's been around for a long time, and it's something we all have to address as one of the areas for protecting our attack surface. It's a hygiene control, if you want to think of it that way, taking care of the things in our organization. So it's been around for a long time, and if we can go to the next slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about the past. So what I'm sharing on this screen here, on this slide, is a quote from Anton Chebakin. You may be familiar with him. He's an analyst at Gartner. He's now a vice president of research at Gartner. He used to cover vulnerability management. And I always like this quote. It was written in his blog one of his blogs from 2015. And I'm not going to read the whole quote to you, but my point in sharing this is if you look at the message here, and look when this was written in 2015, 7 years ago, and he's saying, why don't we know which vulnerabilities to fix first? You know, we started doing vulnerability assessment a long time ago. We started scanning things in the mid-90s, which is, you know, now what, almost 27, 28 years ago, which is like multiple lifespans. And his point here is, gosh, we've been doing this for years, and we're still at a point where, and it's not very funny to many people in IT, we do a scan, we get a report that has thousands of vulnerabilities and may have hundreds of pages of data, and we throw it over the wall to our IT ops and then hope that they do something to patch these vulnerabilities that we found. And if this sounds familiar to you, you're not alone. It's been going on for a long time. And we were curious to know if it's still happening today. So we did a survey this last fall. And if we could go to the next slide, please. I'd like to share with you a little bit of the data that we collected. We did a survey last fall, and we got 100 people or so to respond. And we were curious, and we asked people, so how do you review the risk and vulnerability assessment findings that you come up with in your organization? And unfortunately, as you can see by the data on this graph, almost 25%, almost 1/4 of the people we surveyed are still manually reviewing CVSS scores. Another 50% said, oh, we export CVSS data to create our own reports. So 3/4 of the people out there are still looking at CVSS scores and digging through this data. And if you've done this in your organization, you understand this is a tedious and time-consuming process. And so we asked people in the next question, well, how satisfied are you with the amount of time that it takes your team to review this data to identify what's critical and what you must address first? Again, about 1/4, 27% of our respondents said, well, we're very satisfied. We can get through this with no problem. But that leaves almost 3/4 of our respondents saying, oh, we're not that satisfied. It is a tedious process, and it's not an effective use of a security team's time to dig through a big pile of data of CVSS scores and try and look at the details of those to figure out what are critical vulnerabilities. And so having gone through this exercise and dug through all the data, then what? Is it like Anton Chebakin said back in 2015? Do I still throw it all over the wall and hope that IT patches it? Well, let's look at the next slide, and we'll look at what the data tells us from our survey. So if we could go to the next slide, please. And we asked our survey respondents, so how do you communicate with IT operations to address the high-risk vulnerabilities? Over 1/3 of the audience said, well, we provide them a report of all vulnerabilities and let them to decide what to fix. To me, that does not sound like a successful strategy for getting the critical vulnerabilities patched. Over half of them said, well, we provide them a report of the critical vulnerabilities and ask them to set timelines to fix them. So, 85% of our audience is struggling to get IT to fix things. They're giving, it's not changed substantially from 2015. We are giving them a big list of vulnerabilities. And if you're in an enterprise environment today, when you do a vulnerability scan of a large network or a large environment, you're going to find hundreds, if not thousands of vulnerabilities. And so here we are again, living in the past. And then we asked our audience, well, how confident are you that the highest risk vulnerabilities have been addressed by your organization? Now, this was a little more encouraging. Over 1/3 of the audience said, well, we're very confident that our highest risk vulnerabilities have been addressed. But that leaves 2/3, almost 2/3 saying, well, we're kind of confident, we're somewhat confident. We think that the most critical ones have been addressed. So I guess my point by sharing this data with you is that we haven't changed that much from what Anton Chavakan said 7 or 8 years ago, at least based on the survey data we collected just last fall. People are still scanning for vulnerabilities. People are finding lots of vulnerabilities. They're throwing them over the wall to IT and hoping that they get fixed. And yeah, they're somewhat confident that everything is getting fixed. And it may or may not be. And so I guess my point in this is, if this sounds like what's happening in your organization, you're not alone. We're still at a point where vulnerability management, again, is just one of the dots in enterprise security. So if you think about all the things that you have to do, we're still struggling with this one dot. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Let's talk about this from 2 perspectives. So I've got a couple of images here on this slide. On the left is a hypothetical example of some of the dots that you might be trying to connect in your organization. You may have things like firewalls and asset inventory, some vulnerability assessment and management, maybe secure configuration management, intrusion detection, identity access management. This is just a partial list of the things that you might be trying to work with. And maybe you have a SOC to coordinate all this activity, which is great. My point in sharing this kind of an image with you is that you have a lot of dots to connect. Vulnerability assessment and management is just one of them. And in your efforts to protect the organizations that you lead, you have to be on top of all of these dots. You have to do that collaboration that Anabrita talked about across your organization to make sure that your team members are on top of these different tools, are looking at the data coming out of them, are sharing it with their colleagues, and that you are taking appropriate measures to protect the organizations. And you have to be right all the time on all these tools to make sure that protection is solid. The image on the right side of this slide is what a hacker might look at your organization. He or she might look at your organization as having the crown jewels that they want to steal. And oh, by the way, they only need to find one flaw in one place, and they only need to be right one time. You have to be right across all these attack surface vectors with all these tools and connect all these dots all the time to keep your protection consistent. The hacker only has to find one vulnerability and be right once to get in and exploit your environment. So lots of dots to connect, lots of work to do, and we're still not doing very well with vulnerability assessment, which leads me to talk about the present. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Over the last few years in the vulnerability management world, a new concept, maybe not so new now, called risk-based vulnerability management has emerged. And there are basically 2 things I would argue are the premise for risk-based vulnerability management. Number 1, the first bullet on this slide, is that we have to realize that no one can manage and patch everything. In a large environment where you might have hundreds or thousands of vulnerabilities, it is unrealistic to believe that your IT team can patch everything and keep up with everything. The network changes too fast, the environment changes too fast, new vulnerabilities are introduced. You just can't do it all. So that's one premise that led to the rise of RBVM. The second is that the classic CVSS scoring, the idea of pawing through all that data and looking at CVSS scores, which on the surface might have an identical score, and you have to dig into the details to figure out if two items with the same score are actually the same threat to you. The CVSS score, as we're all familiar with this concept that risk is equal to vulnerability times threat times consequences or impact. And these 10As are built into the CVSS scoring system. Unfortunately, it just isn't granular enough to allow you to do a real prioritization and ranking to find out what's most critical. And this is what the RBVM toolset, what Gartner calls vulnerability prioritization technology, has done over the last couple of years. The RBVM tools have largely done two things. One is adding new risk metrics based on some context and threat with proprietary scores or rankings that go beyond CVSS and actually give you a discrete granular score that allows you to differentiate between different vulnerabilities. So you can say, hey, this vulnerability, which has the same CVSS score as the next vulnerability, is actually a bigger threat to our environment, and we should patch that one first. The second thing that the RBVM platforms have introduced is more automation of the analysis and the measurement to provide some kind of continuous qualification of that threat, so that cyber risk score, that proprietary score, is updated on a continuous basis. It may or may, in many of the tools, it's correlated with threat intelligence or threat intelligence feed, so that you get more context around the vulnerabilities and you can really qualify the level of threat based on the scoring and that correlation with threat data. So that's kind of where we are in the last couple of years. If we go to the next slide, please. In this slide, I'm sharing with you Gartner's methodology for risk-based vulnerability management. And there are really two things that I'd like to point out about this slide. I'm not going to try and read everything on it, and we're happy to share these slides at the end of the presentation. But the first thing about this methodology that I want you to look at and understand is, number one, it's a process. It's not a technical solution, it's a process. In the middle of this diagram, you can see there's a continuous process that starts with assessment, that goes through a prioritization exercise, and then goes through a compensation exercise. And guess what? This is the same process that you're doing if you're using a legacy system where you just do a VA scan, and then you try and figure out by digging through the CVSS data, what's the most critical vulnerability, and then you hand it off to IT to do the patching, or you accept the risk of not patching. So that process is there. That's the core, that's the essence of this. And the second premise, the second point that I want to make about this diagram is that really, if you look at this, we're not just using one or two tools anymore. Now you've got that vulnerability assessment tool, and oh, by the way, there's other things that are going along with it. You've got maybe continuous, cloud security posture assessment, or software testing, or pen testing. You've got multiple areas, multiple attack vectors for just vulnerabilities. This again is just one of the dots. And look at the proliferation of technology here. You go to the prioritization world, part of this process, you've got VPT, you've got threat intelligence, you've got other tools there. And then when you get into compensation, you can look at, well, do I patch? Do I remediate? Do I work? Do I do some segmentation on my network? Do I change my firewall or intrusion detection? Do I work with a SOAR? So the point is that instead of having one or two tools, all of a sudden we have a proliferation of tools. And again, this is just for one of the dots. Here we are in enterprise security with all these dots. I showed that kind of image of the various critical controls you could use, of the technologies you might be deploying. The technology is expanding at a rate that our teams can't keep up with. I know you all have teams, you're all building teams, you're all trying to manage and grow your teams, but again, the proliferation of tools makes it harder for us as enterprise security leaders to connect all these dots. So if we could go to the next slide, please, I'd like to talk a little bit more about what this means for our organization. So again, going back to our survey data, I looked at that methodology and all the tools on it, and I asked the question, hey, so how many tools are you using to find and manage vulnerabilities across your organization? And you can see, if you look at the yellow and the green segments here, over a third of the audience is using 3 or more tools to find and manage vulnerability. And again, we're just talking about one dot in the enterprise security matrix of controls. And this has to be connected with other things in your environment, right? So there's a lot of tools that are being used, and each of those tools requires training and operation and management by the team, and it just makes it hard for your people to be efficient. And then the promise, one of the promises of RBVM is you have a single view of risk across your entire IT stack. I was pleased with the answer to this one. Almost 45%, 44% of our respondents said, yes, we have a dashboard and we have one cyber risk score. Well done. That's great, because that at least gives you a fighting chance to see what's happening in the dynamic environments that you're all managing across these control structures. The disappointing side of this is over half of the audience doesn't have this single view of risk, which means that you're reviewing multiple reports from multiple tools and trying to build that coordination and that collaboration that Rich talked about, or they're just not doing it at all. So again, without that single view of risk across the entire IT stack, you're going to struggle to look across multiple tools, as most of these people in the survey responded said, to figure out what's going on in your environment. So that's where we are with vulnerability management today. And if we go to the next slide, what I'd like to talk about for just a minute here is what other ongoing trends are out there that may have an impact on IT and the security teams. And I see that there are 4 big trends that are continuing to put pressure on security. One, we talked about briefly, and this is what I'd call the ever-expanding attack surface. There are more attack vectors than ever today. You not only have the traditional on-premise infrastructure and traditional networks and endpoints associated with those networks, you have cloud environments, you have hybrid environments, you have one of the things that's not going to go away since the pandemic is the rise of the remote worker and people bringing their own devices to work and needing to hook up to the network from their home office or a shared office space somewhere. I believe that remote work is now something that will be with us forever, and organizations are needing to grapple with that, and networks are no longer going to have the luxury of having fixed endpoints all the time. And oh, by the way, if you're in any kind of an environment with an OT structure, if you've got any kind of industrial capacity, then you have to worry about all the OT or IoT endpoints in your network. So the attack surface expands. It is continuing to expand. It will continue to expand in the future. The second thing I'd like to point out as a trend is what I call the acceleration of the software development lifecycle. Organizations today must have applications or websites or something like that, because that's the storefront of today. It's becoming more and more, the digital transportation makes it more and more important for organizations to have apps, web apps, mobile apps, websites. All of these require software development, and IT organizations are pushed to keep up with this. They have to accelerate the rate of delivering software to deliver value to the organization. Things like DevOps, and where they can say, hey, you know what? Oh, you found something wrong with that instance? We'll just blow it up and we'll have a whole new instance. You can test that one. And what this is, the other thing that people are turning to is open source code. It's quick and dirty and easy to grab some open source code widget and pop it into your application because, hey, somebody else already wrote the code for that. I can just insert that into my app and it'll work just fine, and we'll incorporate it and we'll put it in production. Well, guess what? We looked at some survey data from last year that showed that almost 60% of the apps that were being put in production had some kind of vulnerability embedded in them. because IT organizations and development organizations are just pushed to deliver value more rapidly. They're your partners, you understand this, they have pressure on them just like you have pressure on you. So this cries out for a stronger focus on making sure that there's secure software development, or that at least we're checking the software for vulnerabilities before it gets deployed. The third trend I'd like to point out is the cyber talent gap. I imagine it's just as much of a problem in India as it is in the US today. There's a chronic shortage of talent for cybersecurity teams. You all know this as security leaders. You recruit bright people, you train them, and then guess what? Somebody else recruits them away from you, or they get promoted, and then you're stuck with training someone else all over again. And oh, by the way, if you've got lots of tools deployed to cover all of the dots in your enterprise security control structure, then that makes this talent gap even more stressful, because guess what? Instead of having people manage 1 or 2 tools, maybe they have 3 or 4 or 5 tools they have to be responsible for. And oh, that's a problem. If you lose that person to some other organization, then you've got to find someone else that you can train on those 3 or 4 or 5 tools that they were running. And then the last thing, which I know I don't need to belabor, is that malicious attacks are continuing to increase. And this is driven anymore by nothing more than criminal activity. There are criminals out there who are seeking to exploit organizations. You know, it's easy for some lazy person who knows about coding to go find some ransomware and drop a phishing email on somebody and get a ransom for some Bitcoin and go, gee, that was an easy day's work. And when that's all they are is criminals. But that pressure is there. The number of attacks continues to increase. It will continue to increase. All of these are trends that continue to put pressure on security. And my point in sharing this is just not to be the bearer of bad news, but just to say the reality is that we can't keep just stacking on more tools and more technology to try and solve this problem. Okay, so if we could go to the next slide, let's talk about what this means if we start looking at the future. The image I'm sharing here, if you recall at the beginning of the presentation, I shared the Center for Internet Security's 20 critical security controls. In today's world, 20 is probably not enough. It might be a good start, but on this matrix, you'll see that there is 54 areas of controls that you need to be thinking about. And this control matrix is from Ed Amoroso's TAG Cyber organization in the US. Ed was the CISO at AT&T, one of the US's largest telecom organizations. He was the CISO there for almost 15 years. And after he retired, he started a boutique analyst firm where he's now advising CISOs like him and vendors like us on what he sees as an appropriate control structure for today's world. And you can see that there are, what did I say? There were 20 on the first control matrix I shared with you. Now there's 54. Holy mackerel, talk about having to connect the dots. How many tools are there for each one of these controls? I mean, this is crazy. How do we keep up with this? The second point I want to make on this is, remember I said vulnerability management was one of the critical controls? Well, there it is, circled in blue, number 44. Vulnerability management is still one of the critical controls in today's world, and it will continue to be. We have to do vulnerability management to find those things that are exploitable by malicious criminals and patch the ones that matter the most, okay? So that's kind of a modern look at the controls portfolio. So what can we do about this? If we start to think about the future and where do we go from here, how do we start to connect all these dots? I'd like to spend a couple of minutes talking about that if we could go to the next slide. So one of the things that you can start to think about in terms of your security architecture as a way to help connect the dots is a platform-based architecture. I know, and I'm no different as a chief marketing officer. It's very, I would say it's easy to think about a best of breed, what I'd call a best of breed strategy, where if you can get technology X from vendor X and technology Z from vendor Z, that they are the best at doing what they do, And if you buy their solution, you know that you're doing the best job, you're using the best technology to help you address that particular area of your control environment. What is the challenge or the limitation of that kind of a strategy? Well, hey, I've got the best technology for this control area, but the views of the data are going to be narrow and deep. So you're going to go deep in that one area, but it's a narrow view. It doesn't necessarily connect with the next control that you might have to think about, or something that your team might have to share data across. So it requires that you spend extra time and energy on aggregation, on integration of data. And oh, by the way, like I talked about before, it starts to spread your people more thinly across the different tools that you're trying to manage. Instead of having 1 or 2 tools to manage, maybe you give them 3 or 4, and they have to shift from one tool to the next, and then try and get the data from one tool to the next if they need to connect the dots with that data. In contrast, a platform-based solution is going to give you, by virtue of what a platform is essentially a way to look at data from a centralized perspective, and to give you better visibility and context from something that's architected from the beginning to be an integrated solution. And this allows you to have faster response because you can see more of the data, you can see it quicker. Oh, by the way, if you're using a platform-based architecture, you're going to have lower overhead because you're not going to be dealing with as many vendors and as many software tools that you need to maintain and upgrade and pay maintenance on over the course of the years. And what this allows you to do, one of the things that a platform architecture approach allows you to do, is to gain efficiencies and improve collaboration across the different areas of your team and your control structure. Now, it's interesting if you think about, well, what are the different kinds of platform architectures or solutions that are out there? Cisco, not surprisingly, wrote an article on platform solutions not too long ago, and they argued that there were 3 kind of basic kinds of platforms. First, well, they mentioned it last, but I'll mention it first because Cisco is coming from this perspective, is what they call the portfolio base, where you're going to buy an integrated platform from a vendor like a Cisco or maybe like an IBM, where they have acquired, I'll say acquired, using that word, a number of technologies that span multiple areas of your enterprise security control structure. And then they've built the architecture to somehow integrate the data. So you're getting a portfolio of the tools that they bought. I think when I was looking at IBM a few years ago, they bought something like 25 security companies over the course of a couple of years. And then they said, oh yeah, we can integrate that. That's our portfolio platform. The second kind of a platform would be something like a technology-focused platform, where a solution space based on a particular control has been expanded. And one of the examples of this would be something like a next generation firewall, where you've got the functionality of a traditional firewall, and then things like intrusion prevention or application awareness and control, or maybe some integrated threat intelligence has been bundled in with that next-gen firewall. Another example of a solution-based platform would be something like EPP, where you have EPP, but maybe there's also some endpoint detection and response, or maybe some threat hunting, so that you've got a particular technology platform that's been expanded to include more capabilities. And then the third platform that Cisco talked about as part of your architecture would be something that's either based on SIM or SOAR. You've got a SIM, you've got an aggregation point for your data. And then if you can figure out ways to get reporting that integrates that data in that one place, then you've got that kind of platform approach to aggregating and integrating the data and having a more consolidated view that gives you that ability to respond faster. The other technology that they talked about as a platform-based architecture is something that's starting to gain traction, which is called SOAR, Security, Orchestration, Automation, and Response. And again, the whole premise behind SOAR is that you're consolidating things, and that allows you to, as a matter of fact, why don't we go to the next slide and we'll talk a little about SOAR. If we could move to the next slide, please. So, Gartner talks about the rise of SOAR technologies, and basically what they're saying is SOAR is kind of the wave of the future for them. They are talking about SOAR as the future because it allows organizations to take inputs from a variety of sources, primarily from things like SIMs, and then apply workflows that are aligned to your process or procedures internally so that you can respond to the information, the data, and orchestrate your response to get a better visibility and desired outcomes. And a SOAR technology may or may not be integrated with something like case or incident management. But basically, the premise behind SOAR is that you have a wide data input and a centralized view of that data that allows you to orchestrate your views and take action upon it. The other thing is the automation, which allows you to do things like threat correlation, risk scoring in the context of threat and vulnerability management. And then you have workflows. You kick off a workflow based on what you're seeing in the data. And it's interesting to me when Gartner talks about SOAR technologies, they basically said that there are three kinds of SOAR technologies from their perspective. One is, again, the most obvious one is the automation of security operations, where you can automate and orchestrate workflows and processes and reporting from a SOC perspective. The second one that they talked about, which is of interest, is incident response, which, again, you can start to collect the data and have a centralized view of it. It supports how the organization plans, manages, tracks, and coordinates all the responses to a particular security incident. And then the third technology, which is really the area that tax security is a part of, is threat and vulnerability management, which basically looks at vulnerabilities and the remediation of vulnerabilities across their entire life cycle and includes formalized workflows and collaboration capabilities and reporting. And that's really where tax security has focused. It's our efforts to produce something that starts to accomplish these goals. Gartner's great at making predictions, and I think they figured somewhere around 20% of organizations are going to be using SOAR technologies over the next few years. So this is one of those ways that as an organization you can connect the dots. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. And talk about where we think what this means for vulnerability management, again, which is just one of the dots. In the past, we had legacy VA solutions where you did scans, you had scores. We've moved through that to RBVM, which now adds risk-based priority. And where we are today and looking towards the future is what we would call next generation VM, where you have platform architectures, you've got cyber risk scoring, you've got automation and machine learning that allows you to orchestrate and respond most effectively. So if we could go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like from our perspective. In managing vulnerabilities in the future, we would argue that you need to manage these things continuously across a full cycle, from understanding the inventory of assets all the way through that process to remediation, and that it should include some of the things that I've got listed on this slide. You should automate the detection and use things like machine learning to make sure that you're finding and learning from the vulnerabilities so you can be predictive. Leverage that platform architecture so you can integrate data from multiple sources, including things like threat intelligence. And oh, by the way, we talked about the attack surface. You need to track all of the layers in your IT stack and manage what you find through cyber risk scoring that gives you that granular prioritization. And finally, the remediation has to be effective. You either have automated remediation if your organization can support something like that, or a patch policy that allows you to address the most critical vulnerabilities in an effective manner. So if we go to the last slide, please, that I'm going to talk about. What tax security has done is build something called Enterprise Security One Framework. And this is our approach to trying to connect the dots across these broader premises of the controls. We started as a vulnerability management platform. We built an architecture that allows us to look at data in multiple sources, to aggregate the data and give you a fighting chance to connect the dots. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Trishneet for the last minute or two so he can talk a little bit more about where we are today and what we're doing from a product perspective to help realize this vision. Trishneet, if I could give it to you, please.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate, Chris. It was really helpful session, more on the connecting the dots. I've also learned a lot of new stuff while attending this presentation. Right. So thank you everyone for joining on this webinar. So it's always pleasure to connect back with my Indian fellow friends from the security industry, because these are the guys that who has built tax security, not only just me. So their help, their mentorship, their support has imparted, and that's why we have reached, and that's why we have become global. So thank you so much everyone, first of all. And I will cover only 5 factors, because we are running short with the time, but I will only cover 5 factors which are very important to address in the current state of cybersecurity. So we are tax security. We started as an application security services company, right? Now we are a cyber security boutique, which is focused on risk-based vulnerability management. We are dedicated risk-based vulnerability management company, and we decided to become or maybe focus on vulnerability management 3 years back, and we are one of the first company who's dedicatedly focusing on vulnerability management through our platform ESOF. And we are not just anymore a cybersecurity company. So we cover, we are AI company where we, help companies to prioritize the vulnerabilities through AI program to, cut short with the resources and not to dependent on resources, so they can prioritize the vulnerabilities, important vulnerabilities on auto prioritization through AI. Then we are using machine learning, so where we are predicting the vulnerabilities of future, and the efforts to be made by team on through machine learning program. Then we are, of course, as I said, a vulnerability management company. So third is fourth is comes the cyber security. The fifth is very important point, is a security orchestra, right? So we are a security orchestra company as well. So where we help the companies to manage entire security framework in a single platform, right? Which is very important in current state of cybersecurity. So as Chris has mentioned, so we have recently launched a next generation ESOF VMDR, right? So and it's we are getting a very good response out of it globally. And the second point I would like to talk about is the people, CISOs are focused and overwhelmed with a lot of efforts making to understand the vulnerabilities, right? And the risk, then calculating what is the risk based on the vulnerabilities, right? But we are doing little opposite. We are telling what are the risk based vulnerabilities, right? So through our platform, where you don't have to read a long and lengthy reports, and you don't have to miss the vulnerabilities. Most of the time it's not about identifying the vulnerabilities, it's about giving the priority to the vulnerabilities which has been missed by CISOs or IT security people. That's how that we, any company ends up to the to a breach of attack, right? That's how it happens, right? So it's very important to finding a dot, as Chris has correctly said. It's very important for us to measure and protect each and every asset of our organization. And for a hacker, it's just a one vulnerability which can breach the entire infrastructure of the company, network of the company, right? So that's where you have to prioritize risk-based vulnerability management without the help of resources. When you automate the process, it has more chances of protecting your infrastructure and improving the security infrastructure in that manner. The third point is, I was talking to one of the Fortune 500, global Fortune 500 company in New York last week. So he has joined as a CISO of a company that it's already our customer past 2 years. So he said, one of the best thing the previous CISO has done it for this company is, opting ESOF platform, right? Because now I have joined this company, I immediately got to know where we were 6 months back, 1 year back, where we are now, and what I have to do. So, if I didn't have this platform, I was not aware what kind of vulnerabilities were there, how much time a team takes to patch the vulnerabilities, right? So that is very important. How much time a IT team is taking to patch the vulnerabilities, it's very important to calculate, right? So because, and you have to identify the future vulnerabilities as well, right? So he said, I can see the trend of, history trend of vulnerabilities up to 5 years in a single platform. That's most amazing point for me, that I can measure the security of this organization, and it will help me to, strategize what is, to be done for the organization from way forward, right? So that's what ESOF does. Then the fourth point is definitely the, a single platform, a cyber score. By 2025, it's gonna be, cyber score is gonna be a duo factor of financial scoring system. You would have to have a cyber score, and it's very important. And how would you have a cyber score? You can't have a cyber score of application security in a single platform and infra in another platform, and for a sim and a soc and you go to another platform. You can't do it. You need to have an overall score, and you need to split it in a 5 metric: sim, application, infrastructure, GRC, and people, right? This is what we are already, providing to the Fortune 500 companies, and we are working around this, right? So through the help of security veterans in the industry, and also the Gartner, where we are learning what is the need of the art, right? So I know what I'm talking about is single platform, single score, not to go to different platforms for different needs of security. So it looks like, Barack Obama is getting aggressive, right? We never see him aggressive, but it looks like that way, right? But it's very much possible, and we have helping more than 100 of companies now for vulnerability management with ESOF. And vulnerability management detection and response is need of the hour. So, and it has to be auto assignment. It should not be a resource driven activity anymore, right? So that's where, ESOF VMDR helps the companies like, Fortune 500 companies, the state government. Yeah. So this is what we are up to, and happy to take it forward. If anybody has questions way forward, I'm happy to help them. Thank you so much.
So Trishnet and Chris, there are two questions. Okay, Sanjeev has asked, how do you find the balance between the security control and compliance framework of the world to make sure that actual security is implemented? Hello, am I audible?
I'm sorry, I was on mute.
Yes.
This is Chris.
Oh, okay.
So I guess I would argue, Sanjeev and Anupitra, that I think you start with a security control framework and look to match it to the compliance framework. You're going to have to satisfy the auditors. There's no doubt. I used to be one, so I can say without a doubt that they're going to come around. They're going to ask their questions. They're going to have their checklist. I would start with a control structure and the processes and the tools to deploy that control structure, and then match to the framework. Because what you find if you start to look at the different compliance frameworks is they're going to have common controls across them. So I think if you start with a good control structure, you have a fighting chance to not have to implement multiple compliance control structures. I would argue with the auditors that, hey, if I do vulnerability management and it's required in PCI and it's required in some other standard, then I'm doing that. Or, pick a control, right? Those frameworks help us, I believe.
Yeah, so just to add to that, I think compliance framework, we don't have a choice, right? There is no subjectivity, okay? It's all Boolean. either you're compliant or you're not compliant. So if there's a compliance framework, I think that's mandatory because it is mandated by the regulator or the law of country. But as Chris said, that there will be various controls which will be a part of compliance framework, and control will also be based on the risk quantification, and it will be based on the assessor. How do you measure the risk? How do you quantify the risk? And then what kind of controls, what you implement? And again, controls is, there are various ways of implementing the controls. There's no single way. And what is important is that how do we contain it and how do we reduce the risk? So I just thought like maybe my practical experience, because many times when business comes to us saying that this is a compliance, okay, but I want to take risk approval. And this is where we have to go back to tell them saying that there is no choice for non-meeting the compliance, right? So that's what Sanjeev, as a practice, I think that there has to be a demarcation between how people treat compliance and how people treat the risk control or security controls. Yeah. The second question, Ashish has asked a question. Can one implement SOAR technologies where organizations organically are chaotic and have none predefined processes? How effectively are these technologies in that scenario?
So I guess my comment to this, Ashish, would be, the whole notion of SOAR is to allow you to implement process. So it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to help you build a process if you don't have one. But because by definition, SOAR has the ability to build process into the tool, I think it helps you. If you can argue that I'm building a process, oh, by the way, I'm going to automate it, it's a horrible thing to automate a bad process because all you're going to do is speed up the bad results. But if you take the position that I'm going to start to define the process and use SOAR to implement it, I think that you can make some progress forward. But it's not a silver bullet.
But Ashish, if one don't have a process, honestly, see, SOAR is the automation, right? I think SOAR is the next level of maturity of a process, manual process. And the risk of implementing a SOAR without a process is, if there's a wrong mitigation, wrong blocking of it, I think the impact is going to be huge, actually. So I think it has to be taken with a very due diligence, what to automate and what not to automate. Like one port blocked or one IOC blocked, I think the business may have impact. Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of other questions. I think Shivani has a question whether you offer internships. Yeah, you can get in touch with the tax security. I'm sure they'll be happy, definitely considering the merit. Devnath has one more question. This is the last question which we'll take because we are running out of time. Do you use any software agents? So it is, again, that is practically, Chris, actually, we always have a problem as a practitioner. If there's an agent, then we don't know how agent will behave. So is it an agent-based implementation or agentless implementation? This is what the question of Devnath is, if I have interpreted correctly.
I'm happy to answer this, Anupita. So, ESOF has three products called ESOF AppSec, ESOF VMP, and ESOF VMDR, right? So VMP is a solution where you don't need any agent, right? So you integrate your different hundred of tools, security and IT tools, and to manage the entire IT stack in a single platform, right? So it does not have any agent. It's an agent-less solution, right? But definitely in ESOF VMDR, so to assess the vulnerabilities and configuration assessment through as per CIS benchmark, right? So we have to have installed an agent to have the information from endpoint or a server, right? So any other VMDR solution also has agent, right? So that's how we also have it.